The Demon Child. No one dared go near the last house on Welkin Street anymore. It loomed there at the end of the road, shrouded in shadows even during the brightest parts of the day. People would cross to the other side of the street when they walked by, casting uneasy glances at the darkened windows. They all knew the story, or at least the whispers. They called it the House of the Demon Child. In 1993, it was just an ordinary house, home to a small family, Rebecca and David Foster and their 6-year-old son, Ethan. I was just a teenager back then, but I remember the Fosters well. They were kind people, quick with a smile, and Ethan was the sort of kid who'd go out of his way to say hello to everyone, even if he was a little shy. They were good neighbors, the kind you'd trust with anything. Then one winter night, everything changed. It started with little things, subtle enough that they didn't raise alarms at first. Rebecca mentioned that Ethan was sleepwalking, something he'd never done before. She'd find him standing in the hallway at night, just staring at nothing. He'd mumble strange phrases that didn't make sense and wake up with no memory of it the next morning. She thought it was just a phase, that maybe he was stressed from school or a movie he'd seen. But then his behavior grew more disturbing. Ethan would wake up screaming, his eyes wide with terror. He started talking about the man in the shadows, a figure he claimed stood at the foot of his bed every night. Rebecca and David brushed it off as nightmares, but the fear in Ethan's eyes was unmistakable. He began drawing pictures, disturbing ones for a child, figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths, twisted and contorted in ways that made no sense. It was around this time that I noticed the change in the Fosters themselves. Rebecca looked gaunt and exhausted, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. David, once friendly and outgoing, grew quiet and withdrawn. When neighbors asked if everything was okay, they'd brush it off, saying they were just dealing with some issues at home. But their house was filled with a strange tension that was palpable even from the outside. One night, things took a turn that none of us would ever forget. I remember it vividly. A cold January night, the streets silent under a blanket of snow. I was getting ready for bed when a piercing scream shattered the stillness. It was a sound I'll never forget, shrill and filled with raw terror. I looked out my window and saw Rebecca standing in the street, her hands clasped over her mouth, her face pale as death. She was staring up at the window of Ethan's room. David burst out the front door, running toward her, and they disappeared into the house together. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The next day, word spread quickly. People said that Ethan had tried to hurt himself, that he'd been screaming that he had to escape the man. When the doctors arrived, they found him in his room, curled into a ball, his eyes wide and unblinking. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat. He just stared at the wall, mumbling under his breath. It wasn't long before the rumors began. People claimed Ethan was possessed, that he'd been taken by some dark force. Others whispered that the house itself was cursed. I didn't believe any of it at first. Possessions, curses, those were just stories for scaring kids, right? But then I saw Ethan. It was a few weeks later, and the Fosters had kept him isolated in their house, far from prying eyes. I was out walking one evening when I passed by their place, and for some reason I looked up at his bedroom window. And there he was, standing in the dark, his pale face pressed against the glass. Our eyes met, and for a moment I thought I saw in his gaze. His eyes were dark, almost black, and filled with an emptiness that chilled me to the bone. He raised his hand and pressed it to the window, and I swear I felt something cold creep down my spine. The next day, the Fosters were gone. The house was empty, left in a hurry, with furniture still covered in sheets and dishes still in the sink. The only sign that they'd ever lived there was a small, handwritten note left on the kitchen table. "We're sorry. He's gone. He's taken. Don't look for us." No one ever saw them again. Years passed, and the house sat empty, but people avoided it. There were too many stories, too many whispered warnings. But eventually, memories faded, and a new family moved in, a young couple with a child about the same age as Ethan had been. They didn't know the history, and the townsfolk, perhaps out of pity or a desire to move on, didn't tell them. I was walking past the house one night when I saw their daughter playing in the yard, laughing and twirling in the twilight. She looked up and waved at me, her smile innocent and joyful. But as she turned back toward the house, her face changed, her eyes darkened, and her smile twisted into something unnatural. I felt a cold dread settle over me as I watched her. It was Ethan's face, his expression, staring back at me. She opened her mouth and whispered something, her voice low and filled with malice. "He's still here." The girl turned and walked back into the house, leaving me rooted to the spot, my heart pounding. I didn't sleep that night, and I've avoided that house ever since. I don't know what happened to the Fosters, or if they ever managed to escape whatever dark force had taken hold of Ethan. But I do know this: that house is still there at the end of Welkin Street, and sometimes, late at night, you can hear a child's laughter echoing through the darkness, mingled with a low, menacing whisper. And if you're unlucky enough to catch a glimpse of the window, you might just see a pale face staring back at you, a face with hollow eyes and a twisted smile.